We're parents, teachers, and educators, and like you, we're passionate about restoring our culture for Christ. This is Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education. Today we have with us Louis Markos. Louis, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Martin.
We'll get involved in. By the way, it's Marlon.
I said Marlon.
A
Sorry.
little further into some of these things. Louis is a professor at Houston Christian, formerly Houston Baptist, naturally in Houston, Texas, and has gotten real involved in classical ed. And we'll hear a little bit more about that, I'm sure. But before we get started, tell us about your family and your education and your career.
Well, Marlon, I had to join this whole classical Christian family because all four of my grandparents were actually born in Greece, and they all emigrated to America about 1930. Wow. So the Markos clan has been here almost a century now. I grew up reading the Iliad and the Odyssey, reading Plato, reading it fairly early on, not only because I'm a man of the West and a lover of the great books, but because I'm actually Greek. I grew up in New Jersey, went to Colgate in upstate New York, majored in English and history. Then I went to the University of Michigan for the master's and Ph.D., focusing on English literature. My specialty are really the Romantics and the Victorians, but I also do anything with ancient Greece and Rome, and also increasingly C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Graduated in 91, and I have been teaching at Houston Christian for 33 years. I love the place. And what's wonderful about it is that we are committed to bringing Athens and Jerusalem together, which is one of the major themes in my writing and my speaking. Athens,
I'm looking forward to getting into that a little bit. Good.
Oh, good. We'll get into that. And that's something that undergirds much of what I write. And of course, it undergirds much of what C.S. Lewis wrote as well. Marlon, I mean, every Christian these days, especially evangelicals, C.S. Lewis is one of our role models. But he gets to be a double role model for me because he was an English professor. He also loved mythology and wrote on things like that. Yeah. So again, I've been teaching. Right now, I'm the faculty sponsor for Ratio Christi, which is an apologetics group. I've always loved, I grew up, I didn't even know what Christian education was. And then I slowly learned about it. I met homeschoolers. Those were more, Marlon, when you meet a homeschool girl English major, you swear you're talking to a character out of a Jane Austen novel. And that's when I knew there was something to this whole thing. And so what really started it is when I published a book, gosh, it's almost 20 years ago now, called From Achilles to Christ, Why Christians Should Read the Pagan Classics. Covers the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, the Greek tragedies. And that's really the book that ushered me into this world. And I'll tell you one last thing, Marlon. When I was speaking for these schools, I would bring my kids with me whenever I could. And my son is now in his 9th year teaching at the Geneva School of Boerne, Texas, right next to San Antonio, a classical Christian school, teaches history. And my daughter teaches at a classical charter school in the Dallas area called Founder. She teaches music. So by coming with me to the schools, both of my children saw the love, the joy, the wonder, the camaraderie. It excited them. They saw that these are teachers that don't burn out. And, Marlon, we're in, polarized days, and a lot of people are very, very depressed. I am not depressed because I speak at classical Christian schools all over the country, and wherever I go, the same joy, the same gratitude, the same wonder, the same hope. This is still a Christian country at its heart. But you have to go to these schools and
you routinely get a chance to experience what I get to enjoy as well, and that's watching the kids that use our curriculum and are in our online school, and how they're coming up in wonderful ways that defy what most of the country sometimes espouses, and we're seeing something very different and very wonderful.
It is, and I think it's the hope of the future right now. And luckily, the arc of classical Christian education has not reached its summit yet. I don't know if that's a mixed metaphor, but it hasn't quite got to the top. It's still growing. It's still exciting. There's excitement. COVID taught people what was really going on in our public schools, and they're hungry. And of course, people also homeschool, the university model. There's a lot of choices now.
Right.
But look, Marlon, the Bible says Jesus wept. Nowhere does it say Jesus laughed. but I will prove to you that God has a sense of humor. God is going to preserve the pagan classics by the least likely people imaginable. All of this started with homeschoolers that were Bible-only people, right?
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, as the so-called Ivy Leagues are throwing out Homer, Virgil, Dante, we are embracing it and finding the general revelation that points to the special revelation.
Yeah. Our omnibus curriculum, which is our great books curriculum, has students reading so much of this, and I cannot tell you how much we hear, how enjoyable it is to really understand and to think biblically about these things. And ultimately, in a program like that, people ask, what's the value of that sort of thing? My answer is very simple. It teaches you to think biblically about everything.
It does. And it creates virtuous, morally self-regulating citizens. And that's what we need right now more than anything. If our experiment in democracy is to survive, that is what we need. And I'll tell you one other thing. You heard about the good soil survey that was done many years back?
I've shared it with many people uninitiated with classical education because it is proof positive that what we're doing is working.
And you know what? The thing that stuck out to me were two statistics. Number one, classical Christian educated students were more likely to be opposed to gay marriage than anybody else, but more likely to have a gay friend than anyone else. And Marlon, that's how we change the world. We stand for truth, but with compassion, because we know that when you live in accordance with God's goodness, truth, and beauty, you have a better life. It's not self-destructive. Those are at our best, those are the students we are forming. They believe in the truth. Yeah, the gospel at work. Yeah. It's love in action.
Well, I've been intrigued by some things that you've said and written, and in preparation for this, learned a little bit about your talking about Socrates. You wrote a book called The Myth Made, Fact from Plato to Christ. What were you trying to accomplish with that? What problem were you trying to solve in writing that?
Those are actually two different books. One is The Myth Made Fact, reading Greek and Roman mythology through Christian eyes. And the second one, they came out very close, is Plato to Christ, how Platonic thought shaped the Christian faith. That's from InterVarsity. And both of them are the same basic thesis as from Achilles to Christ and from Aristotle to Christ comes out next year. It is an attempt to understand the difference between general revelation and special revelation. General revelation is the way God speaks to all people through our conscience, through creation, through reason, even through imagination. Special revelation is when God speaks directly through the prophets, through the scriptures, supremely through Christ. And if we take the best of general revelation, I believe that it will point to special revelation. Because look, Marlon, I don't know if this bothered you when you were a young Christian. Are you telling me that before Jesus came, God ignored 99% of humanity? Well, only to the Jews did he speak directly by his first name, if you will, Yahweh. But he didn't ignore everybody else. He spoke in their desires, in their yearnings. Now, again, a lot of the myths are very violent and crazy and all that sort of stuff because look, the Bible says we see dimly in a mirror. Sometimes the pagans saw very dimly in a dirty mirror. But they saw and they yearned, and what they expressed in their greatest literature, history, and philosophy, I believe, points towards the truth.
Yeah. Well, if I got it right, Socrates lived about 400 BC, which was about the time that the Old Testament canon was being closed. There was a 400-year period before the New Testament writings began. And so we have this, what's called intertestamental period that happens about the time that Socrates is on the earth with influence. Is there any connection there? Do you see any?
It is interesting. I mean, some people call it the axial age between about 500 BC and about 600 AD, when you have all the major religious thinkers from Buddha and Zoroaster and of course Socrates all the way down. Of course, Muhammad is 600 AD. All these major periods and
Yeah.
stuff like that. So Socrates is a 5th century figure. He dies in 399 BC. He's living during what's called the golden age of Athens,
Right.
that was begun when the Athenians, with the Spartans and others, defeated the Persians, right? Linking us together with biblical history as well. Xerxes, the same person who almost destroys the Jews and is stopped by his wife Esther. That's the same Xerxes of the famous Battle of the 300 Spartans, right? So we see that coming together there. And then Socrates had a pupil named Plato, and Plato straddles the 5th century and the 4th century BC. And then Aristotle, his student, is a fully 4th century BC character. Now, this is a major age of literature and history and philosophy because, as it says in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, everything is Greek, right? They invented everything. Right? But what's interesting is they were defeated by Sparta in the disastrous Peloponnesian War, leading up to Socrates being executed in 399 BC. And what's interesting is, Marlon, we might have lost a lot of that Greek wisdom, the birthplace of humanism. But about 100 years later, something happens in literally the boondocks, hillbillies of northern Greece, Macedonia. Alexander the Great conquers the world. Now, the world he conquered was actually not Europe. It was Asia. The only part of his empire in Europe was Greece. He was the one who conquered what we today would call Turkey, Iraq, Iran, the Middle East, Egypt, all the way down to North India, Pakistan today. And he spread Hellenism, a Greek culture, a more universal Greek culture, and he spread it throughout the Mediterranean. But he learned his culture from his tutor, Aristotle, who learned it from Plato, who learned it from Socrates. So there is a through line here, Marlon, a real historical through line.
Connection.
Yeah. And when Alexander the Great died, he gave his empire was split. Eventually, it was split into 3. The one side, but the Ptolemies took over Egypt, and the Seleucids took over Asia. And who is Antiochus Epiphanes, who almost destroyed the temple and gives us the Hanukkah, which is part of what we call the Apocrypha. It's in the Apocrypha, not in the canonical Old Testament. But what I'm getting at is that Alexander the Great laid the foundation for the city of Alexandria in North Egypt, one of the great cities of all history. And it's there that they not only edited the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's also there, maybe about 250 BC, that the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek. And that's the New Testament that's clearly being used by Paul and others. Because when Paul quotes, he's generally quoting the Septuagint, the Greek translation, rather than directly going back to the Hebrew. That's why there seems to be discrepancies between Paul and the Old Testament. But that culture and that language is called koine. It's a common version of Greek. That is what united the world. Now, Marlon, we all know as Christians that Jesus came in the fullness of times. A lot of people understand that to mean partly Rome had civilized the world, made it peaceful, made the roads and the waterways safe so that Paul could spread the gospel. But I only believe that's half of fullness. And the other half is Greek culture, which included Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. This was also in the air. And a lot of the early people used words like logos and theos. Now, they didn't use Zeus because that was too corrupted, but they were able to use some of the concepts that Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle got right because of general revelation. Marlon, one of the best things people know about Plato and Socrates is the idea of the forms, that what we have on earth is a sort of imitation of the perfect ideas in the heavens. Well, guess what? Read Hebrews, where Paul, or whoever wrote it, Hebrews tells us that the earthly tabernacle, the temple, is a shadow of the throne room of God. So Plato got something right. And of course, what the great Augustine did is he took Plato's forms and put them in the mind of God, which is where I believe they are. And again, that doesn't mean they got everything right. But they were, I mean, let's talk about this. Okay, was Socrates a monotheist? Okay, he does not know Yahweh. But when you read, especially the apology he gave, which I recently wrote an essay about, when you read the apology, he is clearly moving towards monotheism in the sense that it's clear to him, if there is a God, that God must be the standard of goodness and truth and beauty and
Sure.
justice.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is no joke. If you read Justin Martyr is not only one of the early martyrs, he's one of the early Christian apologists in the early 2nd century, many of whom actually spoke before Roman emperors. And if you read Justin Martyr, Athenagoras, Hippolytus, there's a whole bunch of these early 2nd century apologists. Most of them consider Socrates to be one of the first martyrs for monotheism. They did not believe that he knew Yahweh. He did not read the Old Testament. But he was moving by way of general revelation toward an understanding of what we would call absolute truth, and in a sense was willing to die for that.
Yeah.
And that made him a
So,
martyr for
do
monotheism.
you believe that Socrates had significant exposure to the God of the Old Testament?
I don't see evidence for any direct exposure. It is
Okay.
also, you know what it's like, Marlon. A lot of people some people get a little nervous about general revelation going too far, especially good Calvinists get a little bit nervous sometimes. And so I love reading people who say the Magi must have read something that was passed down by Daniel. Maybe, but there's no reason to theorize that.
Yeah.
Their general revelation showed them that there was a wonder in the sky that they followed, and it led them to Christ.
Convenience is
You know?
hardly proof, is it?
Yeah, it's possible, but I don't think it's necessary. I
Yeah.
mean, you read Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil has what Christians would call an eschatological view of history as having a beginning, a middle, and an end, and moving towards a good end. And I don't see any evidence that he read the Old Testament. Theoretically, he could have got a hold of the Septuagint, maybe, but we don't need that because God has written eternity in the hearts of men. Right? Oh Lord, what did Augustine say? Oh Lord, our hearts are restless. Oh Lord, you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. The God-shaped vacuum that Pascal talks about.
Right.
So I don't see any evidence. Now, I will tell you, Marlon, that some of those early apologists wanting to get in good with their audience would suggest that the Greeks learned everything from Moses, but they certainly had no evidence for that, except for the fact that Socrates was moving, and also Plato, towards something that is at least closer to maybe absolute truth, that there's something beyond. And it's ironic, Marlon, because the people that put Socrates on trial in 399 BC accused him of teaching foreign gods. Okay, and well, no, he was trying to get to the God that's behind the gods. And when Plato wrote his Republic, people still give him grief because he had censorship. Well, what do you mean by censorship? He thinks that young kids should not read about gods raping and killing and meddling with people. Well, it's like, what's his name? DeSantis. It's not censorship of it's young kids should not be reading pornographic stuff. That's all it is.
Yeah.
It's not we're getting rid of the Iliad and the Odyssey
There's
or
a
something like
difference
that.
between censorship and sensible.
Oh, that's a good way to put it. But yeah, that's what we're talking about. And that's really what Plato's talking about, because he's trying to form the virtuous character. I mean, look, would you take your 7-year-old and read him the last chapter of the book of Judges? Really? Is that what he needs to hear at the age of 7? I mean, come on. So again, I like that common sense. That's what it is.
Yeah. Well, it's notable. This is not entirely germane to the vein that we're in, but I just want to make sure that our audience knows this as you refer between Socrates and Plato, that Socrates never wrote anything down. And what we know about Socrates, we learned from Plato primarily. Were there any other sources for learning about Socrates?
There are another source, and that's Xenophon, who was he's most famous for writing a book called the Anabasis. He actually wrote his own apology. The apology is the defense that Socrates made before the jury, and he didn't do a very good job because they put him to death.
Yeah.
So Xenophon talks about it. Also, the great Greek comic playwright Aristophanes kind of makes fun of Socrates in one of his plays. It's called The Clouds. So, I mean, he is a historical figure, but he didn't write. I mean, oddly enough, Jesus didn't write anything except whatever he was writing on the ground with the.
I wasn't suggesting it unusual. I simply wanted it to be noted for our audience, for those that may not know that. What is it about Socrates that has captured your imagination?
You know, I remember when I was in high school and I was in whatever gifted and talented, whatever we called it back then, and I had to fill out a form to apply to be in it. And one of the questions was, whose face would you put on a stamp? And I remember back then, whenever I was 16 or something, I remember saying the person that belongs on a stamp who embodied democracy was Socrates. And I talked about his great apology and defense. And, you know, the people of Athens would have been happy if he just escaped and left. But he said, I'm not going to escape. I am a member of the Athenian democracy. I've agreed to its rules and I will stay here, right? And I will continue to be, he liked to call himself a gadfly. Martin Luther King borrowed that same exact image in his letter from the Birmingham jail. I'm a gadfly that the state is like a horse that's gotten lethargic and I need to sting it. It's a horsefly, basically, a gadfly. I need to sting it and wake it up and force it to deal with what it's trying to sweep under the rug. So Martin Luther King says, I'm not causing racial tension. I'm trying to expose the tension that's already there by forcing people to ask questions, to define things properly. I mean, there's a wonderful moment. You know, the apology is one of the great pieces of rhetoric, but it's again, it's not a good thing if you're trying to save your life. Because one of the reasons they put him on there is because the people were tired of how Socrates kept asking people questions, but they wanted to just stop worrying about justice and be happy with their expediency. And to show them his teaching, he calls forward Miletus, who was one of his accusers. And he says, Miletus, okay, he was accused of three things: teaching foreign gods, making the weaker argument the stronger, and corrupting the youth. And so Socrates said, Miletus, since you believe that I corrupt the youth, it is clear to me that you understand fully what it is that benefits the youth. So tell us, Miletus, what is it in our great democracy that benefits the youth? And of course, he's never thought about that because he doesn't care. He's a politician. And he says, well, tell me, what about the judges? Do the judges benefit the youth? Oh, yes, Socrates. Well, what about the jury? Oh, yeah. Well, what about this? And after a while, he gets the man to admit that every single person in the Athenian democracy benefits the youth except Socrates. Oh, how wonderful that would be if only one man. And we call that a reductio ad absurdum. Classical Christian education kids learn about those things. Sure. But it's wonderful, but all it does is get people more mad at Socrates and more afraid that he's going to turn his dialectic against them. So again, Socrates is going to stand for the truth, is going to stand for his city that he loves. He even compares himself to Achilles, the great hero, who avenged his friend Patroclus, even though he knew it would lead to his death. He stayed true to his loyalty. And that's what Socrates embodies, a kind of courage tied together with a little bit of wit, okay, that says, look, I have been put at a post, just like a soldier. I have been put at a post, and I'm not going to abandon this post. Because if you kill me, you're not going to find another gadfly who cares and loves you as much as I do. And yet they put him to death. He was 70 years old. Yeah. He said, you should have left me a little more time. He probably would enjoy playing golf a little while, Marlon. But
what we have in Socrates has some modern parallels, and I've really appreciated. I didn't know how you would answer the question of what God Socrates referred to when he referred to the name of God. And it's interesting that you say it wasn't Yahweh, but it was maybe that unnamed God that Paul refers to.
Yes.
And the God behind any belief in gods at all. But here, let's bring this conversation into things that are significant and relevant today. The learning from the past is such a tremendous benefit to how we should then live now, as to misquote Francis Schaeffer. But what are some of the misconceptions that we deal with today about antiquity, about the classics, about the times that we call the Golden Age and the classical periods? We have been inclined to one or the other extreme, taking too much from them, believing that they have things some sort of homogeneity with Christianity, or discounting them in some fundamentalist way, saying they're not out of the Bible, we should have nothing to do with them. What is a good balance? And
I think a good balance is
that you're require now, because people are involved in classical education, are already imbibing and embracing that kind of thinking, but help us think more and better about it.
The best way I can do it, this is sort of my metaphor for life, is that Christianity is not the only truth. Oh my gosh, Marlon, I just said that on your show. Christianity is not the only truth, but it is the only complete truth. Let me explain what I mean that. If I say Christianity,
a little bit like natural revelation again.
Yeah, there we go. It is right. Yeah. Hey, one thing that Calvin and Thomas Aquinas agreed on was sensus divinitatis. We all have a sense of the divine. Also, if you read the Institute begins by distinguishing between general revelation and special revelation. And you know what else begins that way? The Calvinist Bible. Marlon, do you know what the Calvinist Bible is? It's Paul's epistle to the Romans and a few other books thrown in. So Romans 1 and 2.
I've never heard it referred to that way. That's pretty funny.
Hey,
and,
with all these Reformed churches I've spoken, I've had to come up with a whole battery of good jokes. One of my favorite jokes I tell is, here's the Calvinist pickup line. You're a boy, you see a pretty girl, you go up to her and you say, your name must be Grace because you're irresistible. So anyway, I've got my battery of Calvinist jokes. But yes, when you read Romans chapter 1, right? Paul says that the pagans are without excuse. How can they be without excuse? They don't have the Bible. They are without excuse because God's glory and power is written in creation. That's the first element of general revelation, creation. Then the chapter 2 of Romans says that the Gentiles who are without the law are a law unto themselves because it's written on their conscience, now approving, now condemning them, right? So those are the two most important elements of general revelation, creation and conscience, but I would also include reason, imagination, other things and whatnot. So if we say Christianity is the only truth, it's like we're dropping a wall and everything that is not truth is complete error. But that's not the world that we live in.
No, it's not. That's far too black and white, and the world's not that way.
Marlon, it is kind of an irony that really the modern classical Christian movement has come out of the sort of Reformed Presbyterian and Calvinist church. Because when I was growing up, there was great misunderstanding as to what total depravity means. Total depravity means that every part of the person has been subjected to the fall. But there are so many people growing up who basically thought it meant utter depravity.
Yeah, everything's as bad as it could possibly be.
Yeah, I mean, this is America. People like Mark Twain, Nathaniel Hawthorne, they don't know Christ, but they understand total depravity, right? But they don't understand grace. And we are totally depraved. We're not utterly depraved. The best way to put it, we have not lost the imago Dei. We have not lost the image of God. God has written eternity in the hearts of men. Look, when I go to Plato to learn something, I am like Moses going to my pagan father-in-law, Jethro, and saying, what do I do, man? These people are killing me. And Jethro goes along and gives me unbelievably good administrative advice. Or I'm like Moses, who was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, as was Joseph before, as Daniel was educated in the wisdom of Babylon and Persia. You're probably familiar with this, Marlon. The early fathers always pointed to Exodus when it says they despoiled or plundered the Egyptians.
Right.
Remember? Now, let's be careful.
A wonderful term that the classical educators have enjoyed embracing.
Oh, yeah.
The Egyptians is what we do, and we take secular material and we learn Christian thinking from it.
Now, we have to be careful because some of that gold that they plundered, they used to make the golden calf. But others of it, they used for the temple to glorify God, or the tabernacle, and then the temple to glorify God. So we have to be discerning. Yes. And of course, we can because we have a touchstone called the Bible and Christ, both of whom are the Word of God. We have that touchstone, but we need to learn. I mean, there are examples in Scripture. I mean, look at the noble centurion Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, right? Here is a man, and he's a God-fearing Gentile, but he can't be saved on his own, right? Peter has to come and present the gospel.
Yeah.
He can't. We cannot save ourselves on our own. But this is a shocking thing to say. But when I read Acts 9 and 10, or Acts 10, it says to me that God, Yahweh, was pleased by Cornelius's good acts towards his people. That doesn't mean the good acts saved him.
Right.
But I mean, look, you remember, Marlon, there's only 2 places in the Gospels where it says Jesus was shocked and awed and amazed. One was when he was shocked by the unbelief of his fellow Nazareth people, right? The other one was when he was shocked by the unbelievable belief of the pagan centurion. By the way, I think that the Greeks and Romans, rather, educated their centurions well, because every time we meet a centurion in Luke or Acts, they're noble people. It's unbelievable how often there are. So,
Louis,
they can
this
learn
has
virtue
been
as well.
wonderful. I know we could go on for hours, but we've run out of time. We should probably do this again.
Oh, definitely. Well, it's Socrates who taught us that we should follow the argument wherever it leads.
Yeah.
And that is what we've been doing this afternoon.
Amen. Louis, thank you so much. And folks, thank you again for joining us on another episode of Veritas Vox, the voice of classical Christian education.
Oh, Marlon, I just should mention that in April, InterVarsity Press is publishing my book, Passing the Torch, An Apology for Classical Christian Education.
That
so
sounds
that's my
like
next
a
book
good
out
thing
for IVP academics. So I'm excited.
Next time. When it's coming out, let me know. We'll get you scheduled, and people will be ready for it for having heard it here.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.